I handed them the keys to my kingdom, and 3 years later, they handed me an eviction notice over a half-eaten turkey. The smell of caramelized brown sugar and toasted pecans usually feels like a hug. But that night, it felt like ashes in my mouth. I was standing in the dining room, a room I had polished for 30 years. A room where I'd celebrated Kel's first tooth and his college graduation, holding a warm pie while my daughter-in-law, Sloane, screamed until the veins in her neck turned purple. "Pay the rent or get out," she hissed, her voice cutting through the festive carols playing softly in the background like a serrated blade. I looked at her crimson nails, the very ones I had paid for just last Tuesday, as a thank you for letting me live in my own garage, and I realized they weren't fashion statements. They were weapons pointed at my heart. Behind her, the Christmas lights blinked in rhythmic mockery, red for the anger in her eyes, green for the greed that had swallowed my family whole. The turkey I had spent for grueling hours preparing, using my own social security money for the bird and the herbs, sat cold and ignored on plates I had washed 1,000 times. Nobody thanked me. Nobody even looked at me. I was 68 years old, a retired trauma nurse who had saved hundreds of lives. Yet I was standing in my own home being treated like a stain on the designer rug. I tried to speak, but my voice felt like it was trapped under a layer of ice. "I contribute," I whispered, my hands shaking so violently the pie dish began to slip. "I cook, I clean, I buy the groceries, I watch the kids." Sloane stepped into my personal space, her expensive perfume another gift from me filling the air until I felt like I was choking. "That's not rent, Evelina," she snapped, her face inches from mine. "We're the ones with the mortgage. We're the ones paying the bills. We need this space for Kel's expanding firm. We need a home office, not a charity case in the garage." I turned my desperate gaze to Kale, my only son. He was sprawled in the oak chair his father had carved by hand 40 years ago, picking at a phantom piece of lint on his sleeve, unable to meet the eyes of the woman who had birthed him. He didn't defend me. He didn't even flinch when his wife told me I had until New Year's to come up with $1,200 or find a sidewalk to sleep on. My total check was $1,400. They wanted to leave me with $200 a month for medicine, gas, and survival. As the room tilted, I looked at my grandchildren, Vance and Rhea, who didn't even look up from their iPhones as their mother dismantled my life. They were scrolling through TikTok, oblivious to the fact that the woman who used to read them bedtime stories was being discarded like yesterday's trash. It was at that moment, as Kale looked up and gave me a cold, stranger smile, saying, "Welcome to the real world, Mom," that something inside me didn't just break, it froze into steel. They thought they were winning a house, but they didn't realize I was holding a secret worth $500,000 and a legal clause that was about to turn their real world into a nightmare. Wait until you see what I found at the bottom of my drawer. They called it the mother-in-law suite, but it was a cold garage that smelled of oil until I opened the envelope that changed my net worth forever. Walking out of that dining room was the hardest and easiest thing I've ever done. As I crossed the floors I had mopped 1,000 times, past the living room where I'd wrapped Christmas presents for grandchildren who didn't even look up at me, I felt a strange numbness taking over. I retreated to the converted garage, the place they called a suite, to feel better about themselves. But it was really just a drafty box with a space heater and a bathroom so cramped I had to turn sideways to use the toilet. The air smelled of old motor oil and winter's chill, a stark contrast to the vanilla-scented warmth of the house I had signed over to them 3 years ago. My hands were shaking as I pulled my 2 weathered suitcases from under the narrow bed, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear or heartbreak. It was from a surge of power I had forgotten the first possessed. I began to pack, folding the practical cotton sets I'd lived in since my husband, Philip, passed away. I packed the dress I wore to his funeral and the photographs of a time when Kale still had love in his eyes. I was preparing to leave the only life I knew, but I wasn't going into the night empty-handed. Deep in my underwear drawer, hidden beneath layers of old fabric, lay a thick, cream-colored envelope that had been gathering dust for 6 months. My lawyer had sent it with a chilling warning: "Open this when you're ready to know the truth about what you're worth." Back then, I was too afraid that knowing my wealth would make me realize how truly transactional my son's love had become. But as I sat on the edge of that narrow bed, the sounds of their laughter echoing faintly from the main house, I tore it open. Inside were property records, investment summaries, and bank statements that made my breath catch in my throat. There was $400,000 from Philippe's life insurance policy, money I had quietly invested with an advisor named Marvin. With careful management and the secret sale of rental properties Kale never knew existed, that amount had blossomed into nearly $600,000, I wasn't just a retired nurse with a $1,400 Social Security check. I was a woman sitting on a fortune while my son tried to extort me for $1,200 a month. I realized then that my poverty had been a test, one that Cale and Sloan had failed spectacularly. I had wanted to know if they would care for me because of who I was, or only because of what I could give them. Now, the answer was written in the coldness of their eyes and the greed in their demands. I didn't cry. Instead, I pulled out my phone and called a rideshare service. While the driver made her way to the curb, I looked at the keys I had been carrying in my purse for half a year, keys to a contemporary 2-story home on the other side of town that I had already bought and furnished in secret. I was done living small so they could live large. As I loaded my suitcases into the trunk of the car, I didn't look back at the house that should have been my sanctuary. I was headed to a place where the heat worked, the water pressure was strong, and no one would ever tell me I was a burden again. I was moving into a mansion while they were arguing over a bounce check. But the real shock comes tomorrow morning, when Cale tries to use his emergency credit card and finds out I've erased his entire lifestyle with one phone call. Ready to see the fallout? I settled into my new velvet armchair and opened my laptop, ready to show them that the real world they promised me was a world they couldn't actually afford. The air in my new home didn't smell of motor oil or neglect. It smelled of expensive vanilla and the sweet, crisp scent of a fresh start. As I sat in my plush reading chair, looking out at the moonlight reflecting off the granite countertops of my kitchen, I felt a stillness I hadn't known in 3 years. But I wasn't just there to rest. I was there to reclaim my dignity. For years, I had been the invisible engine driving Cale and Sloane's lifestyle, subsidizing their arrogance with my silence and my savings. They had stopped saying thank you long ago, choosing instead to treat my $300 monthly grocery contribution and $500 tuition payments for Vance and Rhea as their birthright. They walked around with the newest iPhones while I hovered near Wi-Fi to save data. And they swiped the emergency credit card I gave them for restaurant meals and designer shoes while I lived in a rage. With a steady hand, I opened my laptop and began the systematic process of dismantling the safety net they had spent years shredding. I started with the car insurance, removing Cale from my policy with a few clicks that saved me over $200 a month, money that was now mine to keep. Next came the family cell phone plan. I reached a representative and instructed them to disconnect Cale's line immediately, knowing his screen would go dark by morning. Then, I turned my attention to the credit card. I called the company, reported the card lost, and requested a new one issued only to me, ensuring every pending charge for their emergencies would be declined. I updated every email preference and every password, severing the digital ties that allowed them to track my life or my resources. Finally, I drafted an email to Marvin, my advisor, removing Cale as the beneficiary of my entire estate. I told him I would be in the following week to establish a trust for organizations that help the elderly people like the woman I almost became. As I closed the laptop, a profound silence filled the room, a peace that was both heavy and liberating. I made myself a cup of the expensive loose-leaf tea I had been saving and watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside my window. I realized that for 3 years, I had been a prisoner of my own kindness, waiting for a son to love me who only saw me as a transaction. That night, I slept on a memory foam mattress under a down-filled comforter, with no space heater clanking in the corner and no cold air seeping through a garage door. I woke up at 8 o'clock a.m. instead of 5 o'clock a.m. because nobody needed me to prep their breakfast or start their laundry. When my phone finally buzzed with 6 frantic texts from Cale demanding to know why his credit card was declined and where I had gone, I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I read his words, noted the shift from confusion to entitled anger, and then, with one calm motion, I blocked his number. He thought blocking his number was the end of it, but Cale was about to find out that his mother wasn't just gone, she was his new landlord. Wait until you see the legal time bomb my lawyer found hidden on page 7 of the house deed. He pounded on my door for 23 minutes, screaming for his ATM to come home. While I sat in my new sewing room and listened to the silence of my victory, the peace of my new home was shattered by the high-pitched vibration of my phone. Even though I had blocked Cale and Sloane's primary numbers, they were relentless, using unknown digits and burner apps to bypass my silence. I watched the security feed on my tablet, a state-of-the-art system I'd installed the moment I moved in. On the screen, Cale looked like a man unraveling. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was a bird's nest of frustration, and his face was a shade of red that matched the Christmas lights he'd stood under while evicting me. He was pounding on my front door, his fists rhythmically thudding against the solid oak. "Mom, I know you're in there. Open the door," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the quiet, gated neighborhood. I didn't move. I sat in my upstairs sewing room, the mechanical hum of my machine providing a soothing counterpoint to his tantrum. I focused on the intricate blue and green quilt pieces I was joining together, finding comfort in the precision of the stitches lines that went exactly where I directed them. Unlike the life I'd tried to build for my son, from the camera feed, I watched him try the side gate, which I'd triple-locked, and peer through the front windows with his hands cupped around his eyes like a common thief. He sat in my driveway for another 10 minutes, likely firing off more texts that would never reach me. When he finally drove away, leaving tire marks on the pavement, I felt a strange sense of clinical observation rather than pain. I wasn't the mom he was looking for anymore. I was a woman who had finally learned the value of her own peace. Later that evening, a call came through from a number I didn't recognize, and curiosity or perhaps the need for finality made me answer. "What the hell did you do, Evelina?" Kel's voice was a jagged edge of panic. "The car insurance bounced, our phones are dead, and the credit card is useless. Do you have any idea what kind of mess we're in?" I took a slow sip of my tea, my voice coming out as smooth as silk. "I simply took care of myself, Kale, something I should have done 3 years ago when you moved me into a garage." He started to stammer about mistakes and holiday stress, but I cut him off with a list of numbers that silenced him. $61,920, I said firmly. "That is what I have given you in 3 years of helping out. You wanted me to pay rent. Consider that my deposit for the next decade." He tried to use the children as a shield, claiming Vance and Rhea were asking for me. But I knew the truth, they only asked for me when they needed a handout. I hung up, but the most important task was still ahead of me. I met with my new real estate attorney, a sharp-eyed man who had spent the last week digging through the original deed transfer I'd signed over to Kale. He looked up from the documents and smiled a smile that made my heart race. "Mrs. Winters," he said, tapping a finger on page 7. "Your son's lawyer was sloppy. There's a reversion clause right here. The house they were currently living in wasn't theirs anymore. The moment they asked for rent, the legal ownership flipped back to me like a light switch, and I was about to serve them the most expensive Christmas gift they'd ever received. I caught my daughter-in-law hiding cheap pasta behind her designer purse, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in the gold-plated life I used to fund. The decision to file the paperwork was like pulling a single thread that unraveled their entire tapestry of lies. My attorney confirmed that the reversion clause on page 7 was an ironclad death sentence for their ownership. The second they demanded rent for that all-scented garage, the house legally flipped back into my name. I authorized him to move forward immediately, reclaiming the deed that Kale and Sloan had treated like a trophy rather than a responsibility. A few days later, while the legal gears were grinding in the background, I found myself at the high-end grocery store where Sloan used to spend my money like water. I was selecting organic avocados, the good ones, the ones I no longer had to feel guilty about buying when I felt a pair of burning eyes on the back of my neck. I turned to see Sloan standing near the produce, but she wasn't the polished, terrifying woman who had screamed in my face on Christmas night. Her hair was a matted mess of a ponytail, her skin was sallow without her usual layers of expensive makeup, and she was wearing tattered yoga pants that had seen better days. She looked at me with a mixture of shock and desperate calculation, her mouth hanging open as she realized I wasn't the broken old woman she had discarded. I didn't stop my shopping. I moved toward the tomatoes with a calm, purposeful grace. Sloan followed me, her cart nearly empty except for a few boxes of the cheapest, generic brand pasta and a jar of watered-down sauce. It was a jarring sight. The woman who wore $200 nails was now struggling to afford dinner because I had stopped subsidizing her existence. Evelina, we've been trying to reach you," she stammered, her voice lacking its usual razor-sharp edge. She tried to play the stress card, claiming the holidays had made everyone emotional and that they were willing to work something out. I looked her directly in the eye, letting her see the steel that had replaced my kindness. I told her there was nothing to work out. She wanted me out, I left, and now their financial struggle was a them problem, not a me problem. When she realized her beauty and her bullying no longer worked, she tried the ultimate manipulation. The kids miss you," she lied, her voice rising in a desperate pitch, Vance and Rhea want to know when Grandma is coming home. I stopped my cart and looked at her with a pity that cut deeper than anger. I reminded her that those children didn't even look up from their phones while their father told me to survive on my own. They didn't miss me. They missed the bank account I represented. I walked away, leaving her standing there with her cheap pasta and her expensive, empty purse. As I checked out, paying for my fresh salmon and flowers with my own hard-earned money, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I was no longer the victim of their story. I was the author of my own. And the next chapter was going to be a legal nightmare they never saw coming. She thought the grocery store was an ambush, but the real trap was waiting in her mailbox. While Sloane was crying over pasta, the sheriff was pulling up to my old house with an eviction notice that would put them on the street by February. Ready for the blowout? I watched through the hidden lens as the sheriff handed my son a gold-sealed envelope. And for the first time in years, the screaming in my old house finally stopped. My life had become a masterpiece of quiet intentionality, a stark contrast to the chaotic, grasping existence I'd left behind in that garage. I spent my Tuesday mornings at the local library with the Gilded Pages book club, 10 women who had lived enough life to know that the best chapters often come near the end. We discussed philosophy and thrillers, but mostly we discussed the strength it takes to prune the dead branches from your own family tree. One afternoon, while I was perfecting a watercolor of the lilacs in my new garden, my attorney, Mr. Sterling, called with the news I had been anticipating. The paperwork for the reversion clause had been processed. Legally, the house on Oak Street was no longer Cal's playground, it was mine. He asked if I wanted to delay the serving of the notice until after the new year. But I looked at the blooming flowers on my desk and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. No, I told him, my voice steady. They wanted me out by New Year's. It's only fair I return the favor. 2 days later, the Gilded Pages Club was over, and I was enjoying a slice of lemon tart when I opened my security app. I had kept the remote access to the doorbell camera at the old house, a small digital window into the world I'd abdicated. I watched as a dark sedan pulled up to the curb. A deputy stepped out, adjusted his belt, and walked up the path I used to sweep every morning. When Cale opened the door, he was wearing a silk robe I had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. The deputy didn't offer a greeting. He simply handed over a thick, legal-sized envelope and waited for the signature. I watched Cale's face through the pixelated screen. His expression shifted from confusion to a pale, sickly green as he read the first page. He looked around the neighborhood, his eyes wild, as if searching for me in the shadows of the trees. He didn't know I was miles away, sitting in a velvet chair, finally breathing air that didn't taste like betrayal. The fallout was immediate. My phone, which I had kept on Do Not Disturb, lit up like a Christmas tree. Since I had blocked their primary numbers, the messages came through from Rhea's iPad and Vance's gaming account. Grandma, where are we supposed to go? Rhea's text read, clearly dictated by her mother. I felt a pang of sadness for the children, but it was quickly eclipsed by the memory of them staring at their screens while I was being humiliated. They weren't being evicted by me. They were being evicted by their parents' greed. Later that night, Cale managed to reach me through my friend Norma's phone, tricking her into passing him the line. "You're making us homeless, Mom," he screamed, his voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard before. "We have a life here. Sloane has her committees. The kids have their friends. You can't just take a house back because of one argument." I let him finish his tirade, listening to the entitlement that still curdled his words. "It wasn't one argument, Cale," I said, my voice a calm echo of the nurse I used to be. "It was 3 years of silence while I lived in a garage. It was $60,000 of my blood and sweat that you treated like pocket change. You told me to welcome the real world. This is it. In the real world, actions have consequences and contracts have clauses." I hung up before he could respond, but I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. Instead, I felt a profound sense of closure. I wasn't just taking back a building made of wood and brick. I was taking back the narrative of my life. I was no longer the burden in the garage. I was the architect of my own fate, and for the first time in my 68 years, the foundation was solid. Cale thought he could fight the eviction in court, but he didn't realize I wasn't just taking the house, I was selling it. Wait until you see who I chose as the new owners. And the secret message I left for Sloane in the master bedroom. I returned to my old garage to collect a few forgotten boxes, but what I found taped under my old narrow bed made my blood run colder than the winter air. The legal machinery was turning with a relentless, grinding precision that Cale and Sloane couldn't escape. My attorney, Mr. Sterling, had secured a court order for a preliminary walkthrough of the property to ensure no spite damage was being done before the final eviction date. I decided to go myself. I needed to stand in that space one last time, not as a victim, but as the owner. When I pulled into the driveway of the house Philip and I had built, it looked tired. The lawn was overgrown, and the gutters were sagging, a physical manifestation of the neglect Cale had shown his own heritage. I bypassed the main house and walked straight to the garage, the mother-in-law's suite, where I had spent 3 years of my life. The air still smelled of motor oil and damp concrete. It was empty now, save for a few stray dust bunnies and a sense of profound loneliness that I was finally ready to leave behind. I knelt down to check the floorboards under where my narrow bed had sat, looking for a small box of Philip's old letters I thought I'd missed. Instead, my fingers brushed against a thick stack of papers taped to the underside of the baseboard, hidden in a gap Cale would never have looked at. I pulled them out, expecting old receipts. My heart stopped. They were bank statements and legal notices addressed to Sloan, not for the house, but for a series of high-interest lifestyle loans she had taken out in secret. She hadn't just been spending my money. She had been drowning the family in debt to maintain the illusion of the perfect life she flaunted on social media. The total was staggering, over $150,000 in unsecured debt, much of it used for designer clothes, wellness retreats, and plastic surgery. The most chilling part was a forged signature on one of the applications. It wasn't Kel's, it was mine. I sat on the cold garage floor, the very floor she had told me wasn't worth the utilities I used, and realized the depth of her desperation. She hadn't just wanted me to pay rent. She had needed my $1,200 to cover the minimum interest payments on a house of cards that was about to collapse. As I tucked the papers into my bag, I heard the kitchen door of the main house creak open. Sloan stepped out, looking haggard and hollowed out. She didn't see me at first, but when she did, her eyes flashed with a primal, cornered animal fear. "What are you doing here, Evelina?" she hissed, though the venom lacked its usual strength. "Come to gloat. Come to watch us pack our lives into trash bags." I didn't say a word about the papers in my bag. I simply stood up, brushed the dust from my expensive new slacks, and looked at her with a clinical detachment. "I'm here to reclaim what's mine, Sloan," I said quietly. "All of it." She began to wail, a high-pitched, performative sound about the children and the cruelty of a grandmother who would put her own blood on the street. She didn't realize that I now held the evidence that would not only evict her but could potentially put her behind bars for identity theft. I walked past her, out into the bright winter sun, feeling the weight of the envelope in my bag. I had a choice to make. I could use this to destroy her completely, or I could use it as a final bargaining chip to ensure Cale and the children were at least safe from her financial ruin. But as I looked back at the house, I remembered Cale's cold smirk as he told me to welcome to the real world. Perhaps the real world had one more lesson to teach them. I had the evidence to send Sloan to prison, but I decided on a much more poetic punishment. I sent an anonymous tip to the one person who would make her life a living hell, and it wasn't the police. Are you ready for the friend who showed up at their door? I didn't need to call the police to handle Sloan. I just needed to stop answering the phone for the people she actually owed money to. The stack of papers I'd found, the hidden loans, the astronomical interest rates, and the forged signatures wasn't just a secret. It was a ticking time bomb. I sat in my new sunroom, the winter light casting long shadows across my hardwood floors, and looked at the forged signature on the $50,000 lifestyle loan. Sloan had mimicked my handwriting with a chilling, practiced ease. She had bet everything on the idea that I would never check my credit, or that I would be too confused and elderly to notice a missing chunk of my legacy. I realized then that their demand for $1,200 a month in rent wasn't just about greed. It was a desperate attempt to keep the debt collectors from the front door of the house they thought they had stolen from me. But they didn't realize that when I cut off the credit cards and the cell phones, I hadn't just stopped their spending, I had severed their only remaining lifeline to the banks. A few days later, my old neighbor Patricia called again, her voice hushed with excitement. "Rhonda, you won't believe it. There's a man in a dark suit standing on your old porch. He's been there for an hour, and he doesn't look like a real TA." I knew exactly who he was. He was the mystery friend I had inadvertently summoned by reporting the credit card fraud and notifying the bank of the unauthorized loans. By reclaiming my identity, I had effectively flagged Sloan's secret debts as high-risk defaults. I watched through my security app as the man hammered on the door, a sharp, professional rhythm that made Cale's previous pounding look like a child's tantrum. When Cale finally opened the door, He looked like a ghost. The man didn't hand him a polite legal envelope. He handed him a summons for a forensic audit. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of my own tea kettle whistling in my kitchen. I felt a strange sense of justice, but also a deep, hollow pity. Cale had been so busy welcoming me to the real world that he hadn't noticed his wife was burning their world to the ground right under his nose. Later that evening, Sloane called me from a burner phone, her voice no longer a scream but a broken whimper. "Evelina, please. They're going to take everything. They're saying I committed fraud. If you just tell them you authorized the loan, they'll walk away. We can stay in the house, and we'll never ask for rent again." I looked at the photograph of Philip on my mantle, the man who had worked double shifts so we could have a clean, honest life. "You want me to lie for you, Sloane?" I asked, my voice as cold as the ice on my driveway. "The same way you lied when you told me you'd take care of me forever? The same way you lied when you said the garage was a suite?" I told her that the real world she loved to talk about had arrived, and it didn't accept apologies in place of legal signatures. I hung up and immediately called Mr. Sterling. It was time to stop the eviction and start the repossession. I didn't just want them out. I wanted the house back so I could sell it and ensure that not a single cent of Philippe's hard work went toward paying off Sloane's vanity. I was ready to sell the house to the highest bidder. But then a letter arrived from Kel's teenage daughter, Rhea, containing a secret about her mother that even I hadn't guessed. It changes everything about the eviction. Ready to hear what's really happening inside those walls? I thought I had hardened my heart against everyone in that house, until a handwritten note from Rhea arrived, revealing a secret that made me drop my tea in shock. The resolution of the legal battle felt like a distant storm until a small, lavender-scented envelope appeared in my mailbox. It wasn't from a lawyer or a bank. It was addressed to Grandma Evelina in the looping, uncertain script of my granddaughter. Rhea, for years, she had been a ghost in the house, a silent figure illuminated by the glow of her phone. But as I read her words, I realized she had been an observant witness to the rot I had fled. "Grandma," the letter began, "I know you're mad and I know why. Mom told us you were just tired, but I heard what she said to you on Christmas. I saw her practicing your signature on the dining table for weeks. She told me if I said anything, we'd be living in a tent." My hand began to shake as the reality of Rhea's life came into focus. She wasn't ignoring me out of spite. She was ignoring me out of fear. She described a home that had become a battlefield, where Kel's business failures led to shouting matches that lasted until dawn, and where Sloane's perfect life was a thin veneer over a terrifying addiction to luxury and deception. Rhea's letter wasn't just an apology. It was a cry for help. She wrote about Vance failing his classes because the house was too loud to study, and how Sloane had sold the children's college funds to pay off a friend who had been calling the house with threats. The real world Cale had mocked me with was now a nightmare that was swallowing his children whole. I sat in my quiet, beautiful home and felt a familiar, nursing instinct rise in my chest. I couldn't forgive Cale or Sloane. The betrayal of the garage and the forged signatures were wounds that would never fully heal, but Rhea and Vance were the casualties of a war they hadn't started. I had spent my life as a trauma nurse saving strangers. I couldn't turn my back on the children who carried Philippe's eyes. I called Mr. Sterling and gave him a new set of instructions. We wouldn't just sell the house and walk away. Instead, I used the leverage of the forged documents to force a sit-down meeting. I didn't go to the house. I made them come to my territory-neutral conference room in Mr. Sterling's office. When Cale and Sloane walked in, they looked like they had aged a decade in a month. Sloane tried to put on a brave face, but her designer shoes were scuffed and her eyes were red-rimmed. Cale couldn't even look at me. I laid the forged loan documents on the table between us. The room went deathly silent. "I have enough evidence here to ensure you never work in this town again, Sloane," I said, my voice like cold iron. "And Cale, your silence made you an accomplice. But I'm not here for revenge anymore. I'm here for the children." I offered them a deal that felt like a surgical strike. I would not file criminal charges, and I would provide a modest apartment for the family for 1 year. But there were conditions. Sloane had to enter financial counseling and hand over all access to her accounts to a third-party trustee. Cale had to find a steady job, not a firm, but a job to support his family. And most importantly, Rhea and Vance would spend every weekend at my house, away from the toxicity. If they violated even one term, the eviction and the criminal reports would move forward instantly. They had no choice but to sign. As they left, Cale paused at the door, his voice a whisper. "Why are you doing this, Mom? After what we did?" I looked at him and saw the little boy I used to rock to sleep, buried deep beneath the man he had become. "Because I'm still a mother," I said. Even if you forgot how to be a son, the deal was signed. But the real test was just beginning. Wait until you see what happened during the first weekend Vance and Rhea. Stay with me and the shocking discovery Vance made in my basement that changed his life. Forever, I thought I had hardened my heart against everyone in that house. Until a handwritten note from Rhea arrived, revealing a secret that made me drop my tea in shock. The resolution of the legal battle felt like a distant storm until a small, lavender-scented envelope appeared in my mailbox. It wasn't from a lawyer or a bank. It was addressed to Grandma Evelina in the looping, uncertain script of my granddaughter. Rhea, for years, she had been a ghost in the house, a silent figure illuminated by the glow of her phone. But as I read her words, I realized she had been an observant witness to the rot I had fled. Grandma, the letter began, I know you're mad and I know why. Mom told us you were just tired, but I heard what she said to you on Christmas. I saw her practicing your signature on the dining table for weeks. She told me if I said anything, we'd be living in a tent. My hand began to shake as the reality of Rhea's life came into focus. She wasn't ignoring me out of spite. She was ignoring me out of fear. She described a home that had become a battlefield, where Kel's business failures led to shouting matches that lasted until dawn, and where Sloane's perfect life was a thin veneer over a terrifying addiction to luxury and deception. Rhea's letter wasn't just an apology. It was a cry for help. She wrote about Vance failing his classes because the house was too loud to study, and how Sloane had sold the children's college funds to pay off a friend who had been calling the house with threats. The real world Cale had mocked me with was now a nightmare that was swallowing his children whole. I sat in my quiet, beautiful home and felt a familiar, nursing instinct rise in my chest. I couldn't forgive Cale or Sloane. The betrayal of the garage and the forged signatures were wounds that would never fully heal, but Rhea and Vance were the casualties of a war they hadn't started. I had spent my life as a trauma nurse saving strangers. I couldn't turn my back on the children who carried Philippe's eyes. I called Mr. Sterling and gave him a new set of instructions. We wouldn't just sell the house and walk away. Instead, I used the leverage of the forged documents to force a sit-down meeting. I didn't go to the house. I made them come to my territorial-neutral conference room in Mr. Sterling's office. When Cale and Sloane walked in, they looked like they had aged a decade in a month. Sloane tried to put on a brave face, but her designer shoes were scuffed and her eyes were red-rimmed. Cale couldn't even look at me. I laid the forged loan documents on the table between us. The room went deathly silent. I have enough evidence here to ensure you never work in this town again. Sloane, I said, my voice like cold iron, and Cale, your silence made you an accomplice. But I'm not here for revenge anymore. I'm here for the children. I offered them a deal that felt like a surgical strike. I would not file criminal charges, and I would provide a modest apartment for the family for 1 year. But there were conditions. Sloane had to enter financial counseling and hand over all access to her accounts to a third-party trustee. Cale had to find a steady job, not a firm, but a job to support his family. And most importantly, Rhea and Vance would spend every weekend at my house, away from the toxicity. If they violated even one term, the eviction and the criminal reports would move forward instantly. They had no choice but to sign. As they left, Cale paused at the door, his voice a whisper. Why are you doing this, Mom? After what we did? I looked at him and saw the little boy I used to rock to sleep, buried deep beneath the man he had become. Because I'm still a mother, I said. Even if you forgot how to be a son, the deal was signed. But the real test was just beginning. Wait until you see what happened during the first weekend Vance and Rhea stayed with me and the shocking discovery Vance made in my basement that changed his life forever. I thought I was just teaching my grandson to bake a pie, until he looked at me and asked a question that proved my son's legacy wasn't entirely lost. The first weekend Vance and Rhea stayed with me. The house felt vibrant in a way that made the walls pulse with new life. They arrived with small, cautious bags, their shoulders hunched as if expecting another lecture or another demand for money. Instead, I greeted them with the smell of cinnamon rolls and the total absence of a television or phone screen in the kitchen. Vance, who had spent years hiding behind a headset, found himself in my basement looking for a spare light bulb when he stumbled upon Philippe's old woodworking bench. He emerged holding a small, unfinished wooden birdhouse, his eyes wide with a spark I hadn't seen since he was 6. Grandpa made this? He asked, his voice cracking. We spent that Saturday in the garage, a real garage, clean and filled with tools, sanding the cedar together. I watched his hands, so like Philippe's, move with a newfound purpose. While we worked, he finally spoke the truth. He hadn't hated me. He had been ashamed of his parents and didn't know how to tell me without breaking the family apart. In that moment, As the sawdust danced in the sunlight, the curse of the mother-in-law suite was finally broken. Rhea, on the other hand, found her sanctuary in my sewing room. She was a natural with the machine, her youthful eyes catching the intricate patterns of the wedding ring quilt I had started in my darkest hour. As she stitched, she told me about her dreams of becoming an architect, someone who builds homes where people actually want to stay. We didn't talk much about Kale and Sloane that weekend. We focused on the future. I watched them eat 3 full meals a day, their faces losing that hollow, anxious look they'd carried for years. By Sunday evening, when it was time for them to return to the modest apartment I had provided for their parents, Vance didn't reach for his phone. He reached for me, giving me a hug that felt like a bridge being built over a canyon. I realized then that my victory wasn't in the money I'd saved or the house I'd reclaimed. It was in the 2 young souls I had pulled back from the brink of their parents' wreckage. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Kale had taken a job as a mid-level project manager, earning an honest salary that didn't rely on my subsidies. Sloane was still in counseling, learning for the first time that her value wasn't tied to the label on her handbag. They were humbler, quieter, and while our relationship was still a work in progress, the toxicity had been drained away. I stood in my garden one evening, watching a cardinal land on the feeder Philip and I would have loved. I had honored his legacy not by being a martyr, but by being a beacon. I had shown my family that love isn't a transaction, and that a grandmother's kindness is a gift, not a debt to be collected. I went inside, poured a glass of wine, and sat in my velvet chair, finally at peace in a world that was entirely, beautifully, and rightfully mine. The journey from that cold Christmas dinner to this quiet sunset taught me that the hardest thing you'll ever do is stand up to the people you love. But remember, choosing yourself isn't an act of war, it's an act of survival. If you are living in a shadow, waiting for someone to finally see your worth, stop waiting and start building your own light. My name is Evelina, and I am no longer a stain on anyone's furniture. I am the queen of my own life. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs the courage to walk away from their own garage. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of strength and justice. Until next time, remember, your value is non-negotiable. What would you have done if you found those forged papers? Let me know in the comments. I'm reading every single one.